All right, buckle up, because today we're diving deep into the world of observational research,
Yeah, you've given us a fascinating pile of material to work with.
especially from Shaughnessy's Chapter 4. We're going to be focusing on that a lot today.
Really get into the nitty-gritty of how scientists actually observe behavior.
And trust me, it's way more than just, you know, casual people watching.
Well, absolutely. It's a whole systematic approach with so many layers.
So to kick things off, let's talk about the elephant in the room.
Okay, what's that?
Well, scientists can't observe every single behavior, right?
Hey, that would be impossible. Like trying to watch everything a kid does all day long, you'd go crazy.
Exactly, information overload.
Yeah, so that's where sampling techniques come in.
Sampling.
It's like, think of it like trying a new food.
Okay.
You don't have to eat the whole thing to know if you like it, just a little taste.
I like where this is going. So researchers take little bites of behavior.
Exactly. They carefully choose which behaviors to observe to get a representative snapshot.
That's a great way to put it, a snapshot.
Yeah, so one common method is time sampling.
Time sampling.
They choose specific intervals to observe, like maybe every hour on the hour.
Oh, I see.
Or they might use random intervals, like getting paged at random times and recording what's happening at that moment.
So it's about capturing those moments in time rather than trying to observe continuously.
Right. Because if you only observed, say, a classroom in the mornings,
You'd miss all the afternoon chaos.
exactly, you wouldn't get the full picture.
Now, what if you're interested in something that doesn't happen very often?
Then you'd use event sampling.
Event sampling.
Yeah, where you specifically focus on those key moments you're interested in.
So, like, if you wanted to study how a certain animal reacts to a predator,
You wouldn't sit around all day waiting for a predator to show up.
you'd use event sampling to zero in on those crucial interactions.
Precisely. And then we have situation sampling.
Situation sampling.
This is about observing behavior across different settings or contexts.
Oh, I see, because the environment can have a huge impact on how people act.
Right. Absolutely. Think about how differently you might behave at a party versus at a library.
Or how a squirrel acts in a busy park compared to a quiet forest.
Exactly. To get a complete understanding of behavior, you need to consider the situation.
So, choosing the right sampling method is like laying the groundwork for solid research.
It's all about making sure your observations are representative so you can draw meaningful conclusions.
And speaking of getting a closer look, I hear there are some pretty amazing electronic devices that researchers are using these days.
Oh, yeah. Technology is really changing the game when it comes to observation.
Like, what kind of gadgets are we talking about?
Well, one that's really fascinating is the ER, which stands for electronically activated recording.
ER, that sounds almost like something out of a spy movie.
It kind of is. It's basically a tiny little recorder that someone wears as they go about their day.
And it just records snippets of sound throughout the day.
Exactly, capturing their conversations, their activities, even the sounds of their environment.
Wow, that's incredible. What kind of insights can researchers get from that kind of data?
All sorts. They're using it to study things like how people's moods fluctuate throughout the day,
That looks interesting.
or how our language use relates to our personality and well-being.
I can see how that would be valuable, getting that kind of real-time, unfiltered data.
It's really giving researchers a window into people's everyday lives in a way that wasn't possible before.
Okay, so we've talked about how researchers choose what to observe, but now let's get into the how do they actually go about observing behavior?
Well, when it comes to direct observation, there are two main approaches: observation without intervention and observation with intervention.
Okay, so in the first one, the researcher is kind of like a fly on the wall, just watching and recording what happens naturally.
Exactly. Think of Jane Goodall observing chimpanzees in their natural habitat.
That's a classic example of naturalistic observation.
Right, and there are some big advantages to this approach.
Like what?
Well, first of all, you're seeing behavior as it naturally occurs without any interference from the researcher.
So it's like getting a glimpse into the real world rather than a controlled lab setting.
Exactly. And naturalistic observation can also be really valuable for studying things that would be unethical or impossible to manipulate in a lab.
I see what you mean, like you wouldn't want to create a situation to study the effects of bullying, but you could observe how kids interact on a playground.
Precisely. And it can also be useful for confirming whether the findings from lab studies actually hold up in real-world settings.
Right, because sometimes behavior can be very different depending on the context.
So naturalistic observation helps us see the bigger picture.
So what are some other examples of how naturalistic observation has been used in research?
Well, researchers have used it to study everything from how animals communicate in the wild to how people behave in crowds.
That's fascinating.
There was even a study that looked at the nonverbal cues athletes display during the Olympics. Yeah, they analyzed judo matches to see if there were any universal facial expressions of victory or defeat.
And we're there.
They found that some expressions, like smiling after winning, were remarkably consistent across different cultures.
So it's like a universal language of emotion. That's so cool.
It is, and naturalistic observation isn't limited to the physical world either.
Oh, you mean like online?
Exactly. Researchers can use it to study how people interact in online communities.
Like analyzing conversations in chat rooms or forums
Mhm.
to see how relationships form and dynamics play out.
It's a whole new frontier for observation.
Okay, so that's naturalistic observation. Observing without intervening. What about the flip side? Observation with intervention.
Now, that's where the researcher takes a more active role in setting up the situation.
So instead of just observing what's already happening, they're introducing something new or creating a specific scenario.
Exactly. And there are a few different methods that fall under this category.
Like what?
Well, one is participant observation, where the researcher actually becomes part of the group or situation they're studying.
Oh, wow. So they're not just observing from afar. They're actually immersed in the experience.
Exactly. And this can be done either overtly,
Overtly
meaning the participants know they're being studied,
or covertly.
where the researcher's true identity and purpose are kept secret.
Oh, that sounds a bit sneaky.
It can be, and it definitely raises some ethical concerns,
I bet.
but it can also be a powerful way to gain insights into groups or situations that might be difficult to study otherwise.
So like going undercover to study a cult or something.
Well, maybe not that extreme, but you get the idea.
So what are some of the challenges of participant observation?
Well, one is that it can be hard to maintain objectivity when you're so closely involved with the people you're studying.
Right, you might start to identify with them or see things from their perspective.
And that can make it hard to step back and analyze the situation objectively.
Plus, there's the potential for the researcher's presence to influence the group's behavior.
Even if they're trying to blend in, people might act differently knowing that someone is watching them.
It's like that feeling you get when you know you're being evaluated. You start to second guess yourself.
Exactly. So researchers have to be really careful about how they conduct participant observation to minimize these potential biases.
Okay, so participant observation is one method of observation with intervention. What are some others?
Another one is structured observation, where the researcher sets up a specific situation or task to elicit particular behaviors.
Oh, so they're kind of creating a mini experiment within a natural setting.
Exactly. And this can be a really useful way to study things that might be difficult to observe spontaneously.
Like what?
Well, there's a famous study on inattentional blindness where researchers had a guy dressed as a clown ride a unicycle through a busy college campus.
A clown on a unicycle. That's hilarious.
And they wanted to see how many people would actually notice him.
I bet most people were too busy looking at their phones to notice.
You're right. And that's exactly what they found. People talking on cell phones were much less likely to see the clown than those who weren't distracted.
So it shows how our attention can be so easily hijacked, we miss things that are right in front of us.
That's the power of structured observation. It allows you to create these real-world scenarios to test specific hypotheses.
And it's not just used for studying attention, right?
No, it's been used in all sorts of areas, like developmental psychology.
Piaget, the famous child psychologist, used structured observation to study how kids think and learn.
Right. He'd give them tasks and observe how they approach them, which helped him develop his theories of cognitive development.
Okay, so we've covered participant observation and structured observation. What's the third method of observation with intervention?
That would be field experiments.
Field experiments.
Yeah, it's basically taking the principles of a controlled experiment and applying them to a real-world setting.
So you're manipulating a variable and observing the effect on behavior, but it's happening out in the wild, so to speak.
Exactly. And this can be a really powerful way to study cause and effect relationships in a more natural context.
So what's an example of a field experiment?
There was a study where researchers put pictures of eyes on donation boxes.
Pictures of eyes. What for?
They wanted to see if it would make people more likely to donate.
Did it work?
It did. The boxes with eyes got significantly more donations than the ones without.
Wow, that's fascinating. So just feeling like we're being watched can influence our behavior, even if it's just a picture of eyes.
It seems so. It's a great example of how field experiments can reveal these subtle but powerful influences on our actions.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on direct observation, both with and without intervention.
But there's another whole category of observation that we need to talk about.
Oh, what's that?
Indirect observation.
In direct observation, what does that mean?
It means instead of directly observing behavior, we're looking for clues or traces that behavior has left behind.
So, like, what are we becoming detectives now?
In a way, yes, we're going to be looking at things like physical traces and archival records.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's dive into that.
Physical traces, you can think of them like remnants of behavior.
Remnants, okay.
Yeah, like imagine you walk into a room and see a bunch of empty coffee cups.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
You might infer that someone was there recently and that they like coffee.
Right, even though you didn't actually see them drinking the coffee, the cups are a clue.
Exactly. And researchers use these kinds of clues all the time to study behavior.
So what are some examples of physical traces that researchers might look for?
Well, one category is called use traces, which are basically signs of wear and tear.
Wear and tear, okay.
Yeah, like imagine a library book that's all tattered and dog-eared.
You can tell it's been read a lot, probably a popular one.
Right. Or think about the paths people wear down in a grassy field.
Oh yeah, you can see where people tend to walk, even if there's no official path.
Right, those are all use traces, and they can tell us a lot about how people interact with their environment.
So researchers could use those traces to study things like how people use public spaces.
Exactly. Or they could study things like littering behavior or even eating habits.
Oh, how do they study eating habits with use traces?
Well, there was this study where researchers gave people bags of potato chips,
Okay.
but some of the bags had colored chips inserted at regular intervals.
Colored chips. What was the point of that?
Well, they found that people who had the bags with the colored chips ate significantly fewer chips than those who didn't.
Really? So just having those visual breaks made them more aware of how much they were eating.
It seems so. It's a fascinating example of how subtle cues can influence our behavior.
It's like those colored chips were acting as a reminder to pause and think before mindlessly munching away.
Exactly. So use traces can be really revealing when it comes to understanding human behavior.
Okay, so that's use traces. What about the other category of physical traces?
That would be products, which are basically the things people create or leave behind.
Products?
Yeah, so think about things like artwork, tools, buildings.
Oh, I see. Like archaeologists use those kinds of artifacts to study ancient civilizations.
Exactly. But products can also tell us a lot about contemporary cultures.
Oh, interesting.
Like, think about things like fashion trends, music preferences, or even the types of cars people drive.
Those are all products of our culture, and they can reflect our values and beliefs.
Absolutely. And researchers have used products to study all sorts of things.
Like what?
Well, there's a famous study that looked at the French paradox.
The French paradox. What's that?
It's the observation that the French have relatively low rates of heart disease despite eating a diet that's high in saturated fat.
That is paradoxical.
And one hypothesis to explain this is that the French simply eat smaller portions than people in other cultures.
Smaller portions, okay.
So researchers actually went out and measured the portion sizes in restaurants and grocery stores in France and the US.
And what did they find?
They found that American portions were significantly larger, which supports the idea that portion size could play a role in the French paradox.
That makes sense. If you're eating less overall, even if the food is richer, it might not have the same impact on your health.
It's a great example of how physical traces, in this case portion sizes, can provide clues about cultural differences and their potential health consequences.
Okay, so physical traces can be really interesting, but I imagine we have to be careful about how we interpret them, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's important to consider alternative explanations and to look for converging evidence from other sources.
Right. Just because you see a lot of empty beer bottles in someone's recycling bin doesn't necessarily mean they have a drinking problem.
Exactly. There could be other explanations, like maybe they had a party recently.
It's all about being critical and not jumping to conclusions based on limited evidence.
Right, and that brings us to the other type of indirect observation we mentioned, archival records.
Archival records. So we're talking about things like historical documents and official statistics.
Yeah, but it can be much broader than that.
Like what?
Well, think about all the data that's being generated online these days.
Oh, right. Social media posts, online shopping records, search engine history.
It's a massive amount of information that can be used to study all sorts of things.
That's like a digital footprint of our lives.
Exactly. And researchers are increasingly using these kinds of records to study everything from political attitudes to consumer behavior.
So it's like a whole new era of archival research.
It is, and there's some big advantages to using archival records.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, the data is already there. You don't have to go out and collect it yourself.
That's a big time saver.
And it can also be more objective than other forms of data collection, like self-report surveys.
Right, because people's memories can be faulty or they might not be entirely truthful in their responses.
But with archival records, you're getting a more unbiased view of their behavior.
But archival records probably have their limitations too, right?
Oh, of course, no
Yeah.
method is perfect.
Like, what are some of the potential problems with using archival records?
Well, one issue is selective deposit, which means that not all information is equally likely to be recorded or preserved.
Oh, I see. So, like, if we're looking at historical records, we might only have access to the perspectives of the people who were in power at the time.
Exactly. Or if we're looking at online data, we might only be seeing the information that people choose to share publicly.
It's like a biased sample of reality.
Right, so we have to be careful about generalizing from archival data.
And then there's also the issue of selective survival,
Well,
right?
yes. That's the idea that some records are more likely to survive over time than others.
So, like, delicate documents might degrade, or physical objects might be lost or destroyed.
And that can create gaps in the historical record.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle with some of the pieces missing.
Exactly. So it's important to be aware of these limitations when working with archival records.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on indirect observation, looking at physical traces and archival records.
And those methods can be really valuable for studying behavior in a less intrusive way.
And for getting access to information that might be difficult to obtain through direct observation.
Absolutely. Now let's shift gears and talk about the next crucial step in observational research: recording behavior.
Okay, recording behavior, I'm guessing there's more to it than just jotting down a few notes.
You got it. There's a real art to capturing observations in a way that's both accurate and meaningful.
So how do researchers go about recording their observations?
Well, there are two main approaches: comprehensive records and selected records.
Okay, let's start with comprehensive records. What are those all about?
With comprehensive records, the goal is to capture a complete and detailed account of the behavior as it unfolds.
So it's like painting a picture with words, creating a rich and nuanced description of the scene.
Exactly. And this often involves using narrative records, where the researcher writes down everything they observe in as much detail as possible.
So it's kind of like a running commentary on the action.
Exactly. And these narrative records can be supplemented with audio or video recordings to capture even more detail.
Wow, that sounds pretty intense trying to document every little thing that happens.
It can be challenging, but it's also incredibly valuable because it gives you a complete picture of the context in which the behavior occurred.
Right, because sometimes those little details can end up being really important.
Exactly. And that's why comprehensive records are often used in qualitative research, where the goal is to understand the meaning and significance of behavior rather than just quantifying it.
Okay, so comprehensive records are all about capturing the richness and complexity of behavior. What about selected records?
With selected records, the researcher is focusing on specific behaviors or events that are relevant to their research question.
So it's more targeted and less about capturing everything that happens.
Exactly. And this often involves using checklists or rating scales to quantify the behavior.
So instead of writing long descriptions, you're just marking down how often a certain behavior occurred or how intense it was.
Precisely. And this allows you to analyze the data statistically and look for patterns in relationships.
So, like, if you're studying aggression in children, you might have a checklist with different types of aggressive behaviors and just mark down each time you observe one of those behaviors.
That's a great example. And then you could see if there are any factors that seem to be related to the frequency or intensity of those behaviors.
So it's a more quantitative approach, focusing on the measurable aspects of behavior.
Exactly. And it's often used in quantitative research, where the goal is to test hypotheses and draw generalizable conclusions.
Okay, so we have comprehensive records for capturing the richness of behavior and selected records for quantifying specific aspects. How do researchers decide which approach to use?
It really depends on the research question and the goals of the study.
So if you're interested in understanding the nuances of a particular behavior, you might use comprehensive records.
But if you're more interested in testing a specific hypothesis, you might use selected records.
It's all about choosing the right tool for the job.
And sometimes researchers will use a combination of both approaches to get a more complete picture of the phenomenon they're studying.
Okay, so we've talked about how to record behavior, but now we need to make sure that those observations are accurate and reliable.
That's a crucial point. After all, if our observations are flawed, our conclusions will be too.
So how do researchers ensure that their observations are reliable?
Well, one important factor is inter-observee reliability.
Inter-observer reliability, we talked about that earlier, right?
Yes, it's basically a measure of how much agreement there is between different observers who are watching the same event.
So if two observers are watching the same child and they both agree that the child hit another child 3 times, that would indicate high inter-observer reliability.
Exactly. And the higher the inter-observer reliability, the more confidence we can have in the accuracy of the observations.
Makes sense. It's like having multiple witnesses to an event. If they all tell the same story, it's more likely to be true.
Exactly. And there are different ways to calculate inter-observer reliability depending on the type of data you're collecting.
Okay, so if you're using a checklist, you might just calculate the percentage of agreement between the observers.
But if you're using more complex rating scales, you might use a statistical measure like a correlation coefficient.
So the higher the correlation, the more agreement there is between the observers.
Precisely. And high inter-observer reliability is essential for ensuring that our observations are objective and not just influenced by the individual observer's biases.
Right, because we all have our own subjective experiences and perspectives that can shape how we see the world.
Exactly. And that's one of the biggest challenges of observational research, controlling for those biases.
So how do researchers minimize the impact of their own biases on their observations?
Well, one strategy is to keep the observers blind to the research hypotheses.
Blind, what does that mean?
It means that the observers don't know what the researchers are expecting to find.
So they're less likely to see what they want to see.
Exactly. It's like a safeguard against confirmation bias.
Okay, so blinding the observers is one way to reduce bias. What are some other strategies?
Another important factor is having clear and specific definitions of the behaviors you're observing.
Right, because if the definitions are vague, different observers might interpret them differently.
And that can lead to inconsistencies in the data.
So it's all about being as precise as possible in how you define and measure the behavior.
Exactly. And researchers often spend a lot of time developing coding manuals that outline the specific criteria for each behavior.
So everyone's on the same page about what they're looking for.
Precisely. And it's also important to train the observers thoroughly and make sure they're all applying the criteria consistently.
So it's a lot like training judges for a competition.
In a way, yes. You want to make sure everyone is using the same scoring system.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on how to record behavior and ensure its reliability, but what about the ethical considerations?
Ah, yes. Ethics are paramount in any kind of research, but they're especially important in observational research.
Because even though you're not directly manipulating anything, you're still observing people in their natural environment.
Exactly. And that raises all sorts of potential ethical concerns.
Like what?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is privacy.
Privacy, right, because people might not want to be observed or have their behavior recorded.
And especially if you're observing people in public places, you might inadvertently capture sensitive information that they wouldn't want shared.
So researchers have to be very careful about protecting the confidentiality of the people they're observing.
Absolutely. And that might involve things like blurring out faces in videos or using pseudonyms in research reports.
So the participants can't be identified.
Exactly. And informed consent is also crucial.
Informed consent, meaning that the participants know they're being observed and have agreed to participate.
Exactly. And this can be tricky in observational research, especially if you're observing people in public places where it might not be feasible to get consent from everyone.
So what do researchers do in those situations?
Well, there are different approaches. One is to get consent from a representative sample of the people you're observing.
So like approach every 10th person and ask if they're okay with being part of the study.
Exactly. And another approach is to focus on observing behaviors that are already public.
Like people's interactions in a park or their shopping habits.
Right, because those are things that people are already doing in public, so there's less of an expectation of privacy.
Okay, so privacy and informed consent are two big ethical concerns. Are there any others?
Another important consideration is the potential risks and benefits of the research.
So even though observational research is generally less invasive than other types of research, there's still the potential for harm.
Absolutely. Like if you're observing people in a stressful situation, it could potentially trigger negative emotions.
Or if you're observing sensitive topics, like domestic violence, It could be re-traumatizing for the participants.
So, researchers need to weigh those risks carefully against the potential benefits of the research.
And make sure that the benefits outweigh the risks.
Exactly. And it's also important to have procedures in place to support participants if they do experience any distress as a result of the observation.
Like having a counselor available or providing resources for getting help.
Exactly. It's all about being ethical and responsible in our approach to observation.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into observational research.
From the basics of sampling to the intricacies of recording behavior and the ethical considerations that are so important.
And we've seen how observation can be a powerful tool for understanding human behavior.
But it's also a tool that needs to be used with care and attention to detail.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listeners will remember?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that observation is much more than just watching.
It's about being systematic, objective, and ethical in our approach.
And it's a skill that can be learned and refined with practice.
Right. It's not something that just comes naturally to everyone.
And by understanding the principles of scientific observation, we can all become more astute observers of the world around us.
I love that. It's like a superpower that we can all cultivate.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe those honed observational skills will lead to some fascinating discoveries of your own. So we've covered quite a bit in this deep dive into observational research, haven't we?
Yeah, it's been a real eye-opener learning about all the different ways scientists use observation to understand the world around us.
From those basic building blocks of sampling behavior, making sure you're getting a representative snapshot.
Right, like taking those strategic bites of behavior to get a taste of the whole picture.
Exactly. And then diving into all those fascinating observational methods, each with its own unique strengths and quirks.
Yeah, like being a fly on the wall with naturalistic observation, or even going undercover with participant observation.
Oh, and who could forget those indirect approaches? It's like becoming a detective, uncovering those hidden clues in physical traces and archival records.
Right. It's amazing how much we can learn about behavior without even directly observing it in action.
It really highlights the creativity and resourcefulness of researchers.
Absolutely. But it's also a reminder that observation isn't just about collecting data. It's about interpreting that data thoughtfully and ethically.
Couldn't agree more. It's about recognizing our own biases and striving for objectivity.
And being mindful of the privacy and well-being of those we're observing.
Because ultimately, observation is about understanding human behavior in all its complexity.
And using that understanding to make the world a better place.
Exactly. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that observation is a skill that we can all cultivate, not just scientists.
It's about being present, paying attention to the details, and asking questions.
And being open to new perspectives and interpretations.
Because the more we observe, the more we learn, not just about the world around us, but about ourselves as well.
I love that. It's a reminder that observation is a lifelong journey of discovery.
And one that's filled with endless possibilities.
So to all our listeners out there, keep those observational skills sharp, stay curious, and never stop exploring the fascinating world of human behavior.
Happy observing, everyone.